Ahoy hoy, you curious news junkie you! Welcome to the Independent Review, a weekly podcast where we bring you the latest from the world of independent journalism.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Independent
On this week's show, we will go
Today,
over some different
we will look
clips
at some
of shows
clips from
highlighting
James
the top
Corbett,
journalists this
Taylor
week.
Hudak,
You can
Charlie
always
Robinson,
find more information
Ryan
at
Cristian, and Whitney
independentpreview.news
Webb.
with links to
Let's
every
start
clip that
with
is
this clip
shown.
from James
The best way
Corbett
to find
discussing
more
the
is to
current
create your
and
own
future food
RSS feed of
supply
all of
issue.
your favorites.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is James Corbett. I am the host of the Corbett Report at corbettreport.com. And I would like to thank Meryl Nass and everyone putting together this symposium for inviting me to speak. And specifically, of course, this is the symposium on the attack on food and agriculture and how we can fight back. And I assume that some in the audience might take that title to be purely metaphorical. But I am here today to assure you that this is not a metaphorical idea, that this is quite literally an attack that is taking place on food and agriculture right now.
Breaking news in eastern Oregon, where crews are battling a major fire at a potato chip processing plant. Air 12 flew over the scene at Shearer's Foods on Highway 207 in Hermiston.
This is in Salinas, a huge fire at a food processing plant. This is for Taylor Farms. And right now there are concerns about a huge plume of ammonia coming from this area.
40,000 pounds of food meant to feed people in a food desert near Maricopa, south of the valley, is completely gone. And tonight, investigators are still trying to figure out what caused the fire.
Breaking news out of Pasco County. Crews battling a huge fire at a chicken farm. It's all happening on Cal-Maine Foods along Simpson Farm Lane in Dade City.
Firefighters trying to figure out what sparked a fire at a food processing plant on the west side. It happened around 9:30 last night on Merida Street near South Zarzamora.
We continue to follow that breaking news from Sutter County. A massive fire still burning right now destroyed a historic walnut factory in Live Oak. And as of right now, it shut down a portion of Highway 99 that remains closed.
In Maine, people living near a burnt-out potato processing plant were urged to stay in their homes and close their windows. The Penobscot Micram plant in Belfast, Maine, caught fire early this morning.
A Minnesota egg producer is evaluating the damage left behind from this massive fire. It happened late last night in Howard Lake, straight west of the cities on Highway 12.
Explosions rocked a Lackawanna County business after it caught fire this evening.
Yeah, crews were at the Made Right Steak Company for hours tonight, finally putting out the flames that were involved in that building.
Now, you may think that I am putting that list of clips together as a sort of cherry-picking exercise of just taking a few isolated and scattered incidents and trying to mesh them together in a way that implies that there's some sort of correlation. But I assure you, in fact, it is the exact opposite. In fact, that collection of clips came together when the other day I tasked my video editor, Brock West. I said to him, you know, there have been so many of these fires and explosions and other mysterious incidents at food processing facilities over the past couple of years. Can you just go out and collect, say, a few clips, at least 3, maybe 7 if you can manage it, of different news reports about these types of incidents? And an hour later, he got back to me and said, I could have easily gotten 70 of those clips together. It's insane how much this is happening. And yes, it is insane. In fact, if you really want to glimpse the insanity, I will direct your attention to a Z-Maps map of various incidents that have taken place along these lines, fires and problems at food processing facilities. Of course, in the United States, actually in various places around the world, if you really want to start exploring. But even if you just zoom in on the US in this map, it truly is mind-boggling the number of incidents that one can find here. For example, some sort of collapsed unknown reason grain silos. Okay, well that could be anything. Oh, a fire at night for unknown reasons at a farm. In Colombia, food pantry, blessings, vandalized and stolen food. Well, again, a lot of these incidents, you could make some sort of, of course, things get vandalized, a grain silo might fall over, but fire in the middle of the night, unknown. Hacked, Iowa Green New Cooperative, hacked. Crystal Valley Cooperative grain. Again, there's just so many of these. Fire mid-morning. etc., etc. That, yes, certainly I certainly would not think that all of these incidents are related, but just taking a look at the number of incidents on this map, do you think there might be something going on here? I leave that for you to come to your own conclusions, and of course when I post this to my website, I will include the link to this zmaps.com map. I will note that this, in fact, actually is a list that is primarily populated with incidents from 2021 and 2022. It looks like it hasn't even been updated in a year. So there's a lot of incidents that could be included in this list that are not. But if you are of this skeptical sort and think, well, this could just be a list of coincidences, each and every one of them just completely unrelated and totally coincidental, well, take that up with the well-known conspiracy theorists at American Military News by way of the FBI, who, as this article from last year was pointing out, the FBI was warning of cyber attacks on U.S. food plants after a dozen hit by mysterious fires. And it notes that the FBI's Cyber Division issued a statement last week, that's April of 2022, warning of potential ransomware attacks against the agricultural industry as more than a dozen food processing plants across the United States suffered damage from mysterious fires. Cyber actors may perceive agricultural cooperatives as lucrative targets, with a willingness to pay due to the time-sensitive role they play in agricultural production, the FBI notice warned. A significant disruption of grain production could impact the entire food chain, since grain is not only consumed by humans but also used for animal feed, it added. In addition, a significant disruption of grain and corn production could impact commodities trading and stocks. An attack that disrupts processing at a protein or dairy facility can quickly result in spoiled products and have cascading effects down to the farm level as animals cannot be processed. Now, that FBI warning was specifically geared towards the threat of cyber attacks against these locations. And as you see from that Z-Maps, some of these are indeed cyber incidents, hacks of various sorts. But as this article goes on to note, it does come after the odd coincidence of, at that time, dozens of food processing facility fires and other mysterious incidents that had been collected, noted, and discussed by various commentators. So, including, for the second time in 1 week, a plane crashed into a food processing plant. Again, that may or may not be related, but the sheer number of incidents certainly does suggest that there is something going on. And in fact, even as I was putting this particular presentation together, even after my video editor Brock had compiled that list of clips of various attacks on food processing facilities, here we get the latest from CNN from a few days ago. Cyber attack on food giant Dole temporarily shuts down North American production, company memo says. And there's details of that incident in this article. But it is not simply related to fires, arson, explosions, plane crashes, cyber attacks. There are a number of ways that we can identify that the food production system itself is under attack from a very wide variety of vectors that seem to be coalescing into a crisis that seemingly needs some sort of solution. And we see that perhaps most startlingly in the incredible, essentially shutdown of the global economy and the global food supply chain, let alone other supply chains, in the absolutely insane lockdown measures of the past few years that led to, obviously, a squeezing of the food supply. And this was something that I noted at the time as it was happening there in May of 2020 in an article I wrote called Up Next, The Collapse of the Food Supply Chain. And as always, this is a subscriber editorial, but you can get it for free simply by clicking the free link. And when you do, you'll see the full article in which I note that this isn't these explosions, problems, supply chain bottlenecks, other problems with the food supplies is not simply limited to the United States. It is happening around the globe. In fact, it is happening in Canada and the UK and Europe and China and Japan, and every single one of those is a link to further information, and there should be one for Europe, but it looks like it didn't copy over properly. And it's not just beef and pork supplies that are being disrupted. It's milk and produce and rice and wheat. Again, link for more reading on those particular food supply bottlenecks. And it's not just the food processors whose entire industry is being upended by this chaos. It's wreaking havoc for farmers and truckers and supermarkets and restaurants. And to make it all even more horrific, the crisis won't just affect the food supply itself. It will affect all those workers in these industries who are being laid off as a result of the disruption, who now find themselves among the ranks of the recently unemployed, who are lining up at food banks, which, as you might imagine, are struggling to keep up with the record demand on their dwindling reserves, leading to stampedes in Kenya and protests in Bangladesh and looting in Colombia and clashes in South Africa, as well as the supermarket freakouts and shopping brawls breaking out in the US and Australia and the UK. And I ask rhetorically, can there be any doubt that severe food shortages will cause widespread chaos in the streets of the developed world? And in case there's any doubt, I'll just leave this here. Again, link. All of these are linked up to sources, so you can go and explore that to your heart's content. But I think that the case should be fairly self-explanatory, that there has been a profound attack on the food production system as we have known it in recent years, exacerbated, of course, by the recent invasion of Ukraine by Russia and obviously the upending of the breadbasket of Eurasia, as it were, in Ukraine, and the knock-on effects that has in various countries that depend on Ukraine for supplies of wheat and other grains, as well as fertilizer disruption. I could go on and on and on, and I will provide plenty of links for you if you want to continue exploring these various attacks. But as I say, it doesn't take a great deal of insight to be able to piece together that perhaps there may be some correlation between all of these crises that are converging on the food supply at seemingly the same time and giving rise to the same apparent need for some fundamental transformation of the food supply. And I would like to think that the people who are currently enjoying this symposium probably do not need to be led by the hand to understand or to discover the concept of some sort of false flag event in which crisis is deliberately created, perpetrated, or even just latched onto as an excuse for pushing an already existing agenda. But in case you do need some food for thought along those lines, pun intended, I'll just present these clips from some people you might have heard from before.
You never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before.
Because of these crises, because of the geopolitical concerns, because of the pandemic, heck, because of Brexit, we see NATO stronger too.
I think its task will be to develop an overall strategy for America in this period when really a new world order can be created. It's a great opportunity. It isn't just a crisis.
Hey guys, did you know that the Chinese word for crisis is made up of two characters that mean danger and opportunity, and thus that any crisis can actually be an opportunity? And furthermore, did you know that that entire misunderstanding is based on an inability to properly read Chinese? Well, if you want more elaboration on that, I'll throw a link in the show notes. But that is the level of thinking that these erstwhile would-be world-bestriding rulers of men believe in their hearts, that any crisis is just a potential opportunity for government to do things that otherwise would seem unthinkable. And that, of course, is the underlying basic logic of, well, the false flag attack in particular, but any sort of rule by crisis in general. Whether that crisis is engineered, is part of a coordinated campaign of an attack on the food supply itself, for example, or whether it is simply an ongoing natural phenomenon, a bunch of coincidences that just seem to be happening all at once. At any rate, as long as the perception of crisis is there, it doesn't even have to be a real crisis, but as long as the perception of crisis is there, that is an excuse for people in positions of power to thrust an agenda down the gullet of the public. And you better believe that in the wake of these food supply disruptions that are taking place right now, there are those who are invested, quite literally, in Food 2.0. What is Food 2.0? you might ask? And that's a good question. And I'm sure you are familiar with some of the more normalized elements of the what could be described as food revolution that it has been taking place for some time now. All the synthetic chemicals and heavily processed foods that now dominate the shelves of the supermarket, as well as the genetically modified organisms, plants and animals, that are increasingly being approved for human consumption by various regulatory agencies around the world. But that really just begins to scrape the surface of the bold new technologies that are going to start shoving, and in fact, in some cases already have started shoving, bold new foods down your throat. For example, perhaps you may or may not have heard of the bioengineered spores that are going to be inserted into the food supply so that they can track every single organism, animal or plant, from farm to fork.
Can we hear a little bit about how Annika is changing the security of the supply chains as the world becomes more and more global? Sure. Michelle?
So sort of on a high level, what we do is we use microbes as tracking devices. So what we do is we convert data, digital data, into strands of DNA. We insert that little bit of DNA into a microorganism, a probiotic microorganism, to be honest. And then we can sort of apply that organism and sort of have it hitch a ride on any food or agricultural product or really anything through the supply chain. And the reason we use a microbe to do it is because we engineer it to go into a spore. So a dormant state that allows it to be impervious to high temperatures and UV light, sort of protect that DNA barcode through transit. And so why this is important is because you can spray romaine lettuce, for example, and you can mix it around and wash it and treat it, microwave it. You can have it decay for a month and we can still re-identify sort of each leaf back to its origin. And so based off the different kind of requirements in different supply chains, that microbial tag allows us to get just really granular information throughout the entire transit without having to worry about things like, cross-contamination or of tags, or rubbing off from one thing to another. So it's just an incredibly hardy package of information.
Or have you heard of the company that's using genetically modified microbes to create peptides that taste like sugar but are digested like proteins, which, as the company likes to brag, although these microbes are technically genetically engineered, the desired products can be purified and legally sold as non-GMO.
Now, in nature, in the Garden of Eden, sugar was good enough in the apple to give you sweetness. In some places, some exotic places in today's paradise, in the jungles, this is not enough. Small plants, which are under the canopy of much taller trees, need something more to attract animals to eat their fruit and spread their seeds in new places where there is sun. And for that, they have a protein. Now, this protein in nature is not sufficiently stable. So what we do in our lab is we use a method called computational protein design, in which we take the sequence, a necklace that is the protein, a necklace built out of 20 types of beads called amino acids, and we mix and match them. Because we know that proteins don't grow only in paradise, they also grow in the Dead Sea, in hot springs, in exotic acid swamps and places like that.
So by rearranging the chain there, what's the possibility here in the future? Tell me.
So what we are doing, and you just drank it, we are making a protein which is stable. We are fitting the proteins which are found in the jungle to the mass food market.
And as you've doubtless seen by now, there is a push among seemingly every sector of society, amongst every person of influence on the global stage right now, to get you to eat the bugs.
I'm Nicole Kidman, and I am going to eat a 4-course meal of bug.
Earlier this year, the United Nations held a global conference on the benefits of eating insects, even suggesting it might be a good solution to world hunger.
I don't know why the United States doesn't eat insects when they're actually very healthy for you.
Extraordinary. very moist, chewy. Can't quite describe the flavor, but need a little water.
So, we need to figure out, why is this such an issue in people's minds? Why is this a taboo? Well, as children, we're taught that it's gross, it's disgusting, stay away from the bugs, they're gonna hurt you, they're poisonous. And in most cases, that is absolutely wrong. And to prove this point, 80%. That is the amount of people around the world that are eating insects as a daily part of their diet. See, Western culture is the fringe on this. And if we just change the way that we think about our food, we can change the way that we feed the planet.
Oh, nothing. Oh, awesome. Like nothing you've ever tasted. Like a hairy nut. Don't. Oh my gosh. A nut from the shell.
The farmers of tomorrow are the engineers of today. We've created specialist chambers to look after the insects, their different life cycles. We can stack this 4 meters high and as many kilometers long as you like. We have automation systems that are modulated and run by themselves 24 hours a day, 365 days a year in any environmental condition. And that's vitally important to feeding a growing population.
These are exquisite grasshoppers. I recommend them to anyone. Thank you for spending so much time with me and watching me eat bugs. Till next time.
And whether you have consumed them yourself or not, I am sure that you have seen the Impossible Burgers and the Beyond Meats and the I can't believe this didn't come from an animal lab-produced synthetic meat products that are increasingly being sold. But have you heard of synthetic celebrity cannibalism?
According to its website, Bite Labs wants to collect tissue samples from celebrities. Not for stalking, not for cloning, no, for making meat. That's right. They say they want to take the tissue, isolate the muscle stem cells, and grow the meat in bioreactors, thus making artesian salami out of your favorite stars. Each will apparently have about 30% celebrity meat and 40% animal meat, along with fats and spices. Believed and hoped to be a prank, Time magazine contacted Bite Labs to learn more and got this statement from someone who identified himself as the CEO, keeping up the charade, saying, "We want to prompt widespread discussion about bioethics, lab-grown meats, and celebrity culture. This is very important to us. We think the cultural discussion around lab-grown meats and popular culture will acclimate people to the field." According to the Bite Lab team, Jennifer Lawrence and James Franco are some of the more desired cuisines you can look hopefully forward to should they get permission and should this be real. Though I myself am looking forward to a prime cut of George Clooney.
Oh, don't worry, guys. That Bite Labs synthetic celebrity meat thing, that was a hoax or an art project or a bunch of activists who were trying to draw attention to the possibility of synthetic cannibalism or something like that. Anyway, they're not selling anything for real, so I guess it's all okay. That being what it is, I will leave you in your own time to explore some of the many, many, many lab-produced artificial food-like products that are in the process of being developed to already being shoved down the throat of the public in various forms. In fact, as you may have seen, the EU itself recently approved cricket powder for human consumption. In low enough levels, you don't even have to report it. So, pretty soon, we will be eating bugs, whether we know it or not. If we continue along the current path of buying foods at the supermarket without thinking about what we're buying. More on which at the end of today's presentation, but I think it is important to note a couple of things here. One is that there is a great food reset that is happening at the moment. It is a food 2.0, food revolution, whatever you want to call it, and I have detailed the various types of food technologies that are coming online or are already being sold to the public in a recent editorial I wrote called What is the Future of Food, that I will direct you to, where you can find many more links exploring some of the things that we've been looking at in these short clips. But I think for the purposes of today's presentation, let's tie in this concerted attack on the food supply that appears to be going on. At least the crisis is there, and the FBI and others are warning us of this crisis, and the seeming solution that is swooping down to save us from this crisis, which is we will have to fundamentally transform the food supply of the planet itself in order to continue feeding the human population. Now, as I say, that great food reset is happening. The obvious questions that arise from that observation are who is doing this and why are they doing this? Now, the first question I think is easy enough to answer, at least to throw out some names that I think, at the very least, if you have not researched yet, you can begin to do so. I wrote about this in a follow-up article to What is the Future of Food called Who is Behind the Great Food Reset, which I will also exhort you to take a look at if you are interested in this subject. But obviously some of the names that come up in there will be, I think, familiar to people who would be attending this symposium, like the Rockefeller Foundation, which not only pioneered the supposed so-called Green Revolution of the 1950s, 60s that began setting the world down the slippery path towards the Gene Revolution, more on which in a moment, in which the factory farming system was institutionalized and spread around the world through the auspices of such things as the U.S. government Food for Peace program that was essentially funding the large seed cartels and petroleum interests like the Rockefeller family were obviously heavily invested in, and others that enabled this industrialization of the food supply to proceed apace. And although obviously the Rockefeller Foundation and their cohorts have lots of money to throw at the PR surrounding that green revolution, which they like to brag fed 1 billion people around the world, or whatever it is that number has grown to, in reality, there are much, much deeper questions and problems that have arisen in the result of the destruction of traditional farming systems and communities in favor of these large industrial factory farming types of endeavors that themselves have given rise to the gene revolution, or at least provided an outlet for that gene revolution to take place, whereby now more and more resources of the the Rockefeller Foundation, I get ahead of myself, and others are going towards developing specifically crops and increasingly livestock who are genetically modified and tailored for various environments that, again, is being sold as a wonderful revolution that will increase yields, etc., etc., although there is much, much evidence to show that that is, in fact, not the case. And also, as an added bonus, we get the absolute environmental destruction of the smothering of the planet in glyphosate, just to name one of the chemicals that is attendant upon this GMO cultivation, that has now become the most used agricultural product in human history and is having health effects around the world. Much, much more to say on that. Again, please, at the very least, type glyphosate into my search bar and you will start to be able to explore some of that. But I do, of course, raise the specter of the gene revolution and some of the other philanthropic endeavors like the Rockefeller Foundation that have gotten involved in this in recent years, like, of course, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and perhaps more to the point, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Trust, which is the investment vehicle, which is technically separate from the foundation, which is involved in its philanthropic endeavors. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Trust is the investment vehicle which is used to fund that philanthropic endeavor. And yes, you better believe, of course, Gates is invested in all sorts of aspects of the Great Food Reset, including the aforementioned Impossible Meat and Beyond Burgers and what have you, in order to profit off of the very types of food technology which we are being told is going to save the world from this perceived crisis. There's obviously a lot of information to explore there, and although the fact checkers of the world will tell you that it is not important that Bill Gates is now the single largest farmland holder in the United States, that's not important because it's just a tiny percentage of the overall farmland in the United States. It, at the very least, should give anyone who is being intellectually honest pause for thought why this multi-billionaire philanthropist is so deeply, so heavily invested in agricultural production at the same time that he is also invested in the alternatives to this agricultural production that are represented by the lab-grown meats of the future of food. There are many, many, many other players at this table, however, and that deserve to be explored. Of course, the previously alluded to Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum with their consistent pimping of the Eat the Bugs agenda would be one person on that list, as would such things as the Davos of Food, which you may or may not have heard of, but you probably will in future. It's called the Eat Forum, the Stockholm Eat Forum, which convenes people, high-ranking industrial tycoons and others, bigwigs in the food world, for talks about how to transform the global food supply and the fundamental ways in which people derive their food. There are some interesting things to note about an organization like that. We could also explore the links of, again, philanthropic endeavors like U.S. aid, which is surely something that all sides of the phony left-right spectrum can get behind. Of course, because it's the U.S. government giving its wonderful aid to people around the world with significant strings attached. And I don't think you need a lot of imagination to see how that can be used to foist transformations like the aforementioned green and gene revolutions on the developing world. There's so many other players at this table and so many things to get into. I will point you, for example, to an editorial I wrote a couple of years ago on Another Globalist Simulation Comes True, which shows that just as Event 201, the simulation of a globally spreading coronavirus, was taking place at pretty much the exact same time that we were asked to believe that that was actually taking place in reality, we also had the Food Chain Reaction Game, a war game, a simulation that was taking place back in 2015 that had a number of interesting elements to it. It was participated in and steered by such illustrious bodies as the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation and the United Nations Environment Program, along with some of the corporate entities that are heavily involved in the cartelization of the food supply, like Louis Dreyfus Commodities, Mars Inc., Thomson Reuters, other interesting players at that table who were wargaming out potential food crises in the future, including a 2022 looming possibility of food supply disruption that ended with in the war game simulation that was taking place again 8 years ago, ended with the EU imposing a meat tax, which eventuated ultimately, as the game played out, in a global carbon tax to save us from the scourge of global warming related food crises. So ultimately, the United Nations, of course, gets its pound of flesh as payment to the weather gods. So an awful lot of... There are many, many, many other players that could be talked about in this developing, ongoing, concerted attack on the food supply that is taking place, and the types of technologies that are being foisted on us in order to affect that transformation. But for the purposes of today's presentation, I think the other side of that question that we raised the specter of earlier is important to answer. Why are these players involved in this Food 2.0 revolution? And the obvious common factor that obviously unites, I think, every player at this table is the crass and obvious answer of money. And of course, there is lots of money to be made, especially when we start taking the natural abundance of the productivity of the earth itself, the incredible abundance of seeds giving rise to new life with minimal inputs. That process, which has sustained humanity throughout countless generations, is being swept aside out of expediency, out of necessity because of the impending global warming crisis or something along those lines, and being replaced with lab-manufactured synthetic food products that are coming from corporations. Again, it does not take a genius to understand how the monopolization of the food supply, or the cartelization of the food supply, would be very financially lucrative for all of the people literally invested in that food transformation. But having said that, I do not think that the monetary incentive is the sole explanatory agent here, and I don't think it's even the most convincing one. Yes, there certainly is money to be made, and that will unite all of these players in this agenda, but I think that there is a much deeper agenda going on here, and that is alluded to in my use of the moniker the Great Food Reset, because I think Food 2.0 and this revolution that we are living through is very much connected into the Great Reset that the World Economic Forum has been talking about for the last few years, propounded by the likes of Klaus Schwab, who has told us repeatedly that the Great Reset involves all of these incredible systemic transformations that are brought about by Fourth Industrial Revolution technologies, the brain chips and the AI and the synthetic foods and whatever else is coming, that will ultimately serve to converge our biological and physical and digital identities. Now, that sounds like a very pie-in-the-sky concept, so there's a lot that needs to be elaborated on in order to truly appreciate what is being said in a statement like that. But I think it is important to note that there is a broader transformation, not just of the food supply, but if we are what we eat, then the transformation of the food supply does indicate a transformation of humanity itself. And just as organisms are increasingly being genetically modified and engineered, I think the human species is also being transformed, engineered, genetically and otherwise, by the types of technologies that I think the food transformation, Food 2.0, are just one subset of. This is part of a larger transhuman agenda, which is embodied in that phrase by Klaus Schwab. Again, do not take this from James Corbett. Take it from people like Schwab, who are promising that the future holds the convergence of our biological and digital identities. I think humans are being engineered to better interface with machines as the brain chips and other technologies start to come online. And well, I think the machines will require different energy components than simply this organic food stuff that we've been used to as regular substrate human 1.0. This will sound absolutely outlandish to people who have not studied this agenda. And all I can say is I have thousands and thousands of hours of media that I think will start to fill in some of the blanks that sound absolutely outlandish to people who have not encountered this before. Some of the key words that I would highly suggest that you check out not only include the aforementioned transhumanism, but specifically the key phrase biodigital convergence. And once again, please do not take it from James Corbett, Joe Schmo living in Japan. Who's this guy? Please take it from the sources themselves. For example, I will point you in the direction of a very interesting document from Policy Horizons Canada, a future think-do tank that is part of the government of Canada, that put out a document on biodigital convergence a few years ago and followed it up just, I believe, last year, talking about this melding of the physical and digital worlds as machines become more and more integrated with organic life, and start to think of this engineering of the food supply in those terms, because at that point, I think we start to see this is about much more than simply accruing dollars in the bank accounts of some of these would-be world controllers. Once again, there is a lot of information here and a lot to go through. So when I post this to my website, I will, of course, as usual, post all of the documents that I cite, all of the references that you have watched or observed today will be there in the show notes for you to begin exploring these extremely deep matters. But I just want to, at the very least, put on the plate today that connection between all of these coincidental or purposeful attacks on the food supply that are taking place right now, and how that is leading to a transformation of the food supply that in turn is feeding into a transformation of the human species itself. These are incredibly important, incredibly large topics. So I hope that this presentation is at least opened the door to get you thinking along the lines of this. So at the very least, you can identify this agenda, and you, as a sovereign, independent human being, can take actions to, at the very least, not literally buy into this agenda by simply buying whatever is on the supermarket shelves without even thinking about it. No, there are things that we can do. And so finally, as I am wont to do at the Corbett Report, I will leave you today with something a little bit more hopeful. At any rate, something that we can be doing about this, the solution side of this. I also wrote a follow-up editorial to the previous two mentioned editorials, The Future of Food is Ours to Decide, where I talk about our role in either accepting, literally buying into this agenda as it is rolled out to us, or rejecting it, and finding alternative ways of feeding ourselves, as humanity has done for countless generations before us. I do not think that the problems we are facing are insurmountable and can only be solved by the would-be rulers of the world who are using every crisis as a potential opportunity. That being said, I am out of my allotted time for today, so I want to thank you very much for your time and attention, and direct you once again to CorbettReport.com for more information on this subject.
Next, let's jump to the Macroaggressions podcast with Charlie Robinson's interview with Corey Hughes and his book about the JFK assassination.
Like a Lee Harvey Oswald character might have been brought up specifically to play a role in, maybe not in this event, but in some event. And this turned out to be the event that he was, his starring performance.
100% believe that. He had a first cousin named Dorothea Moret, whose father was Charles Dutz Moret, who worked directly for Carlos Marcello. But his first cousin Dorothea, it is heavily suspected that she was also in the false defector program as like a higher up, as a supervisor, because she ended up during the height of the Cold War in the late 50s and early 60s. She ended up going to Europe and visiting all these Eastern Bloc countries at roughly the same time that Oswald was in the Soviet Union. So there's some weird stuff going on there with the family, connected to Marcello, which means connected to the CIA, because you can't separate the mob and the CIA at this time.
Yeah, but it is reasonable for someone to think that Oswald was a communist because he was going to the Soviet Union.
Right. Well, he got on television and said that he was a communist. Right. So why shouldn't we believe him? Right. Of course we can't believe him, because that whole incident with Oswald getting on television was set up in the first place.
Right.
So Oswald, being associated with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, he was told to hand out those flyers on the street corner. Right. Well, when you dig into the story of the flyers, you come to find out that Douglas Jones, who owned Jones Printing, who printed those flyers, when he was questioned by Harold Weisberg, basically, he identified Kerry Thornley, not Lee Harvey Oswald, as the man who picked up the flyers. So when you look back at all the correspondence allegedly between Oswald and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, it's obviously the whole thing was set up. Oswald had nothing to do with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. His only entanglements with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee were those days where he was told to go hand out flyers. Kerry Thornley had the flyers printed and handed to him and told him to go hand them out. Kerry Thornley is one of the two men who was impersonating Oswald all over from New Orleans to Dallas. And the way I was able to determine it was Kerry Thornley is because when you go through these Weisberg documents, specifically on the false Oswald, you'll come to find that you'll find patterns within patterns, right? So of all these Oswald interactions that I determined were not Oswald, you had different personality types interacting with these people. So you had a personality type that was real boisterous and braggart and, just kind of a show off, right? That was one of the personalities that kept interacting with people. And there was another personality that was more of just a dick, right? Would be real short with people, snide with them. And it was a totally different personality. And when I came to figure out who these personalities belonged to, they belonged to two men in particular, William Seymour and Kerry Thornley. And virtually every single incident of people that we know of that we attribute to Lee Harvey Oswald was actually not Oswald, could be attributed to one of these two men, up to and including Oswald's employment at the book depository.
Really?
Yes. There was no evidence that Oswald worked at the book depository, and I promise you he was not there on November 22nd.
So that then who was? That's the
So-
the question. Who was this?
Right.
Who was this fake Oswald?
Right. So on November 22nd in Dallas, you have two people impersonating Oswald or being mistaken for Oswald in different places. And that's William Seymour and that's Kerry Thornley. So in the morning, you have a couple incidents near the boarding house that Oswald allegedly stayed at. But let me give you a clue. Oswald never stayed at any of the boarding houses that he is attributed to. Kerry Thornley stayed at the boarding houses that Oswald is alleged to have stayed at, because he was impersonating Oswald, because they were creating this legend of a dissident communist. They were creating this persona. Everywhere these guys went, they talked about shooting guns or talked about communism, even if it was completely out of place. He goes to the store to buy a newspaper and he talks about communism to the guy at the store. It's like, why would you do these things? All over Oak Cliff and all over Dallas, there were seeds planted that this person came in, talked about communism, all this stuff. And back in the 60s, when your driver's license didn't even have your picture on it, it was really easy to interchange people. And you have to think, if someone comes into your store and they buy something from you and they start talking about communism and you don't ever see him again, and then a month later, Lee Harvey Oswald is on television and they're telling you that he's a devout communist and he kind of looks like the guy who was in your store a month ago, but you can't really remember. You're going to go, I think that might have been that guy who was in my store.
Yeah.
That's very prevalent. And none of those incidences that are in the documents were ever actually Oswald whatsoever. But on November 22nd, you have Kerry Thornley, who is in Oak Cliff, and Kerry Thornley is ultimately responsible for the shooting of J.D. Tippit, along with David Ferry. Officer
J.D.
Tippit
was the cop, right?
Correct. He was the cop who was shot just prior to Oswald's alleged flight to the Texas Theater, which is a whole other setup and staged event.
Yeah.
And going through all the documents on the Texas Theater, I couldn't even figure out who the first cops on scene were. When you go through all the testimony of people, you have a woman named Julia Postal who's working at the ticket counter. She never sees Oswald until later when she changes her story to say, oh, I saw him go in and he ran from us and all this. Like, everybody changes their story after they're given the talk by the Dallas police or whomever, right?
Right.
So Julia Postal says that she calls the cops to have them come out. But when you look at the timestamps of when that call went out and when it went over the radio and when cops actually showed up on scene, it looks as though cops showed up on scene prior to Julia Postal making that phone call. And I can't figure out who those cops actually were because there's so much obfuscation. The cops who were dispatched, who are credited with being the first cops on scene, most certainly are not. So you have another setup staged event at Oswald. This is the first time we've seen Oswald at all. None of the events we attribute to Oswald were Lee Harvey Oswald until he shows up at the Texas Theater. This is the first time in all of my research that I have actually encountered the real Oswald doing anything other than the documents that show that he had relationships with George de Mohrenschildt and Ruth and Michael Payne, and that crowd that were basically his CIA handlers. Other than that, there are no incidents involving the real Oswald until he shows up at the theater.
What was his explanation for being there then in Dallas? I mean, obviously the fake guy is working at the depository, but he's now in Dallas after being all over the place, Soviet Union, wherever, Mexico City, I think, didn't you say?
Right.
And now he's in Dallas. What is his explanation for even being there? What's his reasons?
We don't know. And this is one thing I need to point out. There are a lot of statements that Oswald said this in custody. Right.
I don't know if I trust any of those.
Right. Exactly. That's my point. If it didn't happen on film, if you don't see Oswald saying it, I don't believe he said it. I think that most of the stuff that's been released to us as Oswald said this is all fake. We can't trust any of it because those guys are all liars. So anything that allegedly would be said by Oswald should just be disregarded.
This is actually the benefit of us being 60 years down the road, because now a lot of people, back then they'd say, well, he said this in custody, and they'd say, well, I guess then he said it. And now if you tell me, well, he said this in custody, I'd be like, well, show me the tape. Otherwise, I don't trust cops. You're an ex-cop.
There were no notes taken.
Not to trust cops.
Right. Oh, definitely. There were no notes taken, and if there were, they've never been released.
There's no. You're interviewing the guy that shot the president, and there's no notes taken.
Yes,
that doesn't make any sense.
Right, Oswald. The one thing that I do believe from some of the statements about Oswald was that he seemed very confused, like genuinely had no idea what was going on, like out of Kafka's The Trial. And so I think that to me speaks volumes that he genuinely had no idea any of this was going on, didn't know this was being set up, had nothing to do. I don't think Oswald was in town to just go work at a book depository or work menial jobs. There are some documents that talk about a guy named Thomas Kane. And Thomas Kane was working with the FBI and being sent on various missions to Canada and a couple other places. And it looks like Oswald was using that alias of Thomas Kane. It can't be proven right now, but there's enough evidence to make me think that there's something to it. And if that's the case, then Oswald was almost never in Dallas. He might have lived there, but he was being flown out to do missions for the FBI. So that to me makes perfect sense because he definitely was not working at the book depository. And even when they asked him, were you in that building? He gave him a typical spycraft answer. He said, naturally, if I worked in that building. But he didn't confirm that he was in that building because I can tell you he wasn't in that building. I believe that Oswald was in Fort Worth all morning until he caught a cab to the Texas Theater driven by a guy named Travie Delano Bo Click. Bo Click is related to Bernice Click, who was an associate of Jack Ruby. And Bo Click died in a mysterious, small plane crash in 1967.
Yeah, that happens.
That happens. So when I look at the totality of circumstances, to me, it appears pretty clear that Oswald stayed the night in Fort Worth, stayed there all morning, and then caught a cab to the Texas Theater. It was Kerry Thornley, who was involved with the Tippit shooting and doing all the impersonations in Oak Cliff. And there are about 3 or 4 sightings of Oswald that morning in Oak Cliff when Oswald's supposed to be at work. But the real Oswald is nowhere. All right, he's in Fort Worth at this time. William Seymour was working in the book depository as Lee Harvey Oswald. And what evidence do I have for this? Well, there's so much evidence for this. It's unbelievable. And it comes back, first off, I have William Seymour captured in the Robert Hughes film, back by the railroad yards. So William Seymour was on scene. He was there. And I can tell you Oswald wasn't. I then have, there's an incident allegedly with Oswald on the second floor of the depository where he's encountered by Roy Truly and Officer Baker. And Oswald is drinking a Coke, right, in the second floor lunchroom. That never happened. That's a myth. Somebody made that up out of thin air. That incident actually occurred between the 3rd and 4th floors on the stairwell, and it didn't happen till at least 1238. So I rewrote the entire timeline of the assassination because the timeline given to us is bullshit. Yeah. They had to shift Officer Baker's story to encountering Oswald in the lunchroom 90 seconds after the assassination had occurred because they had to cover for the fact that Baker actually made an arrest in Dealey Plaza of the shooter at the Daltex building. The shooter at the Daltex building was Emilio Santana, and I'm convinced that he was an anti-Castro Cuban, but he was there on behalf of the mafia. I believe that he was arrested in Dealey Plaza because we have the Willis 10 photos, and the Willis 10 photos clearly show a man dressed all in black with a rifle getting arrested in front of the book depository, but that is not mentioned anywhere in any of the documents or official story or any of that stuff. So I rewrote the timeline to indicate that that incident didn't happen until 1238. And then we have allegedly Oswald fleeing from the side of the book depository where he leaves in a green Nash Rambler station wagon. And the green Nash Rambler station wagon, I trace back to Lawrence Howard, who was a partner of William Seymour. To me, all these pieces fit. I actually identified the 2 other shooters in the building. On the roof was Sergio Arcacha Smith, the only other anti-Castro Cuban. But again, he was a bagman for the mob, not there on behalf of anti-Castro Cubans. And Lauren Hall, who was part of this trio of Lawrence Howard, William Seymour, and Lauren Hall, who traveled the country back and forth with each other post 1960, because they were all part of this like mercenary group Interpen with Jerry Hemming down in Miami. But most of those guys lived either in Phoenix or in Los Angeles, so they would travel back and forth with each other.
They were like hitmen, like a team of
they were
contract killers.
Not exactly.
Problem solvers.
They were straight up mercenaries. Most of the time, they were used for training anti-Castro Cubans who were exiles for use on missions to Cuba, which they did. They sent a bunch of missions to Cuba illegally, to go blow stuff up or whatever. And that's what those guys would do. They were all-purpose mercenaries who, when they got out of their service, they didn't know what to do with themselves. Right? They were gung ho like cold-blooded mercenary types. And what do you do when you get out of the fucking military and you don't know what to do with yourself and you want to keep killing people? You go to the CIA.
You
right?
go to work for Blackwater.
Right. Totally. Back then, I don't think there were private agencies like that. But so you would go to the one that there is, the CIA, and that's where they all went. Because the CIA would dole out just infinite fucking money for these people to do whatever. They would pay these guys just to do nothing sometimes because they had nothing for them to do, but they didn't want to lose them as contacts, so they'd keep paying them. I mean, like, it's fucking disgusting how many billions or possibly trillions of dollars have gone on fucking intelligence fucking bottomless pits.
Yeah. For God knows what. So how many shooters are on scene for this event in Dallas?
A lot.
And so they weren't going to let this guy.
No,
they weren't going to let him get through. He was in a shooting gallery.
Right. They were.
If we were drawing this up like a military operation, he was driving into an ambush.
Yes,
like a multifaceted, layered ambush from a bunch of different directions, which explains the reason why he's bouncing all over the place in the car, right?
Right. So you have 4 primary locations. You have the shooter at the Daltex building, and the shooter at the Daltex building was actually not inside the building. The shooter was out front, underneath the fire escape. So the shots that were parallel to the vehicle, the shot that hit the curb that struck the piece of concrete, then struck James Tague in the face. We know about that shot. And the shots to Kennedy's back, those shots came from Emilio Santana at the Daltex. It is literally about 4 foot off the ground, the pedestal that he was standing on, and he was hidden in the shadows. But I was able to uncover a man standing there with a rifle when I did some photoshopping and changing of the filters and stuff. So, but then you have the book depository, and you have 3 shooters at the book depository. On the 6th floor, you have Lawrence Howard and Lauren Hall, the 2 mercenaries who were hanging with William Seymour. And William Seymour was working in the building as Oswald. And at this point in time, I have him down on the 1st floor guarding the elevators. Then you have on the roof Sergio Arcacha Smith, who was a former Cuban diplomat, actually worked in the Cuban government, exiled to America, started working for the CIA, started setting up all of these anti-Castro front companies. Mm-hmm. But it turns out all the anti-Castro front companies were just that, front companies. They were nothing more than CIA money gathering and laundering operations, because none of these guys gave 2 fucks about Cuba. Cuba is so irrelevant in the Kennedy assassination. I can't even begin to explain it.
Well, but it's a great cover story. Everybody was mad about the Cuba stuff, and it makes sense, and you can use that. But again, if the official story is that these guys were mad at Cuba, then you can definitely, or they were Cubans or whatever, then you can definitely count that out, right? If that's the official story, then it most definitely had nothing to do with that.
Right. So in the book depository, you have those guys who I've then been able to trace their movements. Actually, I've been able to trace all the movements of everybody throughout the book depository that day. And I can tell you with certainty, like, there was no Lee Harvey Oswald present there that day. William Seymour was working in the building as Oswald. And then you have people like Buell Frazier, who allegedly claimed to have driven Oswald to work that morning. And he had with him a package, allegedly, of curtain rods that he carried into the building. That whole story is fake too. That story was a planted story. Never happened. Buell Frazier didn't drive anybody to work that day. And we know that because of the statements of Charles Shields, who was a Texas School Book Depository warehouse employee. Didn't work in the actual building itself, but across the street in a warehouse. When he sees Buell Frazier come in that morning, Buell Frazier is alone, and he asks him, "Where's your rider?" And he tells him that he dropped his rider off at the front of the building. But that contradicts the story that Buell Frazier has told for the last 60 years, that Oswald walked through the railroad yards with a package under his arm. So Oswald was not there that day. Buell Frazier's a fucking liar. His sister is allegedly the one who got him the job there at in the first place through Ruth Payne. So there's some odd familial connections to the Buell Frazier and his sister, Linnie Mae Randall, to intelligence, because Linnie Mae Randall is who got the ball rolling with him, but Oswald allegedly getting the job at the book depository in the first place. But that whole story is a fiction. Like, everything about this damn Kennedy assassination is a fiction that we've been told.
Who was running the book depository? Was it a front company? Was it?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. So the Texas School Book Depository was the main company that had leased the building. It was a CIA front company for sure. You got to think the CIA is not going to let some Joe Schmo print textbooks. Okay. You really think they're going to let anybody just put whatever they want into a textbook that children are going to learn in school? No, that's where you get stories about the Holocaust and fucking how Lincoln was a great man and all this crap. Right. So, But then when you look at the individual companies in that building, you had Scott Forsman, you had Macmillan, you had Southwest Publishing, and when you research these companies individually, they're all fucking CIA contractors. So the CIA ran that building. It was a CIA front. All four guys who ran that company, O.V. Campbell, Roy Truly, William Shelley, Joe Molina, all OSS during World War II. All of them worked in CIA publishing afterwards, because you got to think CIA controls the propaganda in America, all of it, whether it comes through the news or whatever, books, you name it, the CIA is in control of it. So
unless it's Pearson Publishing and then Bill Gates owns it.
Right. And then there's still connections to DARPA and all that stuff in there somewhere. So like we're totally fucked as far as a culture and society goes. Like intelligence communities have destroyed us as a people. These people should be fucking drawn and quartered.
Of course.
So when you get past the book depository, you get to the pergola area. The pergola is that big concrete structure. And there were two shooters that I can put at the pergola. You have Dave Yaris, who was a OG hitman. He was responsible for organizing the assassination of Mayor Anton Cermak in Miami, back in 1930. Was it 33? 33, yeah. And so he's involved. He's old guy at this time, 60, 65 years old. He's then filmed back in the railroad yards afterwards. And behind the pergola, I can't exactly put a rifle in his hand, but I can tell you he was there because he was the tall tramp. And that's Danny Green, the Irishman from Cleveland. So Danny Green, most people, when I talk to them about Danny Green, having worked with the Cleveland mob, they look at me like I'm a moron. But the fucking reality is that before Danny Green went to war with the Cleveland mob, he was part of the Cleveland mob. He worked directly for a guy named Leo Mosseri, who was the old tramp in Dealey Plaza. And that's how I was able to figure out that Danny Green was one of the shooters, because he was a sniper trainer in the Marines. When he got out of the Marines, he went to go work for the Genovese family on the railroads up in New York. He then got basically transferred or traded to the Licavolis in Cleveland, where he went to work for Leo Mosseri. Now, the assassination happens. Shortly after the assassination, in early 64, Danny Green takes over the Longshoresman Union. This is the biggest union in Cleveland, and he's a nobody. He was rewarded. If you go back and use like newspapers.com and search old newspapers, you will find there were a bunch of articles that were written about Danny Green saying, who the hell is this guy? Where did he come from? And how did he take over the most powerful union in Cleveland? Well, I'll tell you, because he was the tall tramp and he was one of the shooters, and he was rewarded with that union. So yeah, I put him behind the pergola.
By the way, if people think that stuff doesn't happen, look at the generals that were involved in 9/11. That when obviously the event happened, that should rightly have been demoted. Instead, after 9/11, look at where they got promoted to. So whenever you agree to be a part of this on behalf of the intelligence agencies or empire or whatever, and you do your job poorly, which is, or, you do your job, which is to do it poorly if you're these military guys for 9/11, or do it well if you're a hitman for Kennedy. Afterwards, you can tell their level of involvement by how they're treated when they're elevated in status, when they're given general stars for the way they managed 9/11, which was a disaster, then they're in on it. And much like this, if you see a guy who nobody knows what he's, who he is or what he's doing, but you know who he is, and then you see him all of a sudden get elevated and everyone's going, where'd this guy come from? You know that's how it works. Again, so continue on with this.
And so then when we get to the grassy knoll, you have two shooters on the grassy knoll. The first shot that struck Kennedy in the throat did come from the front. It was shot by David Ferry. David Ferry then tosses his rifle to another man named Andrew Jerome Blackman. And then Blackman breaks down the rifle, puts it in a toolbox. This is all seen by a guy named Ed Hoffman. For 50 years, people have debated the identity of the rifleman observed by Ed Hoffman. Well, I can tell you with 100% certainty it was David Ferry. David Ferry was in Dallas. From there, he'll be seen by a witness behind the book depository. He'll then make his way in a gray Plymouth over to the shooting of J.D. Tippit, where he and Kerry Thornley will assassinate J.D. Tippit. And the quintessential grassy knoll shooter is the one and only Jack Valente. And if you want to talk about being rewarded, Jack Valente is the most rewarded guy possibly in the history of the world. So Jack Valente shot the president from the grassy knoll and then goes to work in the White House that day. It doesn't get much more corrupt than that, does it?
No, he's on the plane with Kennedy, when
Johnson, yeah,
when Johnson's getting sworn in, isn't he?
Yep, he sure
shot
is.
the president, and he's on the plane.
So check this out. So allegedly, at this point, Valenti and Johnson have a business relationship only allegedly because he handled Johnson's campaigns and he handled the 60 Kennedy presidential campaign through his company Weekly and Valenti, which is like an ad firm. But by the time that the assassination happens, when you come to understand who Jack Valenti is, you come to understand that going back to the 1940s when he was allegedly in World War II, that he's actually a hitman. He is a spy, and he was recruited probably by Henry Kissinger in his days up in Harvard for intelligence work. But his entire war record's a lie. He's allegedly a bombing hero, flew 50 bombing missions, but I've been able to narrow down his, out of all the time during World War II, he was allegedly only in Europe for 4 months of it. So I highly doubt he flew 50 bombing missions in 4 months. The guy's a complete fucking fraud. But he and Johnson had been close since 56. And so the day that the assassination happens, after Jack Valenti makes his way to Parkland Hospital, he plants the magic bullet. Okay. He's then grabbed by Cliff Carter and brought to Johnson because Johnson wants to hire him and put him in the White House. Okay. So if that's the case, then Valenti coming in would be seen as kind of a new guy, and he wouldn't have all of the access to Johnson put before him. He wouldn't be given the keys to the kingdom on day one. However, when you talk to some of the people who were on Air Force One, they say that you didn't get to talk to Johnson unless you went through Valenti, period. And that was on day one. So that goes to show you on day one how important Jack Valenti was.
And Jack Valenti is known to the general public best by his job doing what?
He was the head of the Motion Picture Association of America from 1966 until 2004. Let me see if I can explain this. Every person here listening to this grew up in an era where they were propagandized directly by Jack Valenti. So
the Kennedy shooter.
The Kennedy shooter, the shooter on the grassy knoll, yes. And he, not only that, Jack Valenti directly created the movie rating system, the PG-R. That was Jack Valenti's creation. And that was not done to protect anybody. That was a mechanism of censorship. Because if you didn't hit a certain rating, you weren't going to be put in certain theaters. They would put restrictions on where rated R movies could be. Mm-hmm. And they knew that if you got a rated R movie, you were going to get half the exposure. And if you got a PG movie, this is at least in the early days how this worked.
Right.
And so the entire movie rating system created by Jack Valenti via the CIA, because he was working for the CIA all the way back. That's just enough. That was just a mechanism of censorship.
And we know that the Department of Defense has their own division in Hollywood. I mean, this is known. It's not denied or anything like that. If you want to use the aircraft carriers for Top Gun, then you've got to give DoD final script approval. That's part of the deal. So, the intelligence agencies are there.
There's another thing that I haven't told you this. Maybe I mentioned it in passing, but do you remember the PMRC?
PMRC. What is it?
That was the Tipper Gore. And they were trying to get the music banned for Satanism and all that stuff. Yeah. Well, the PMRC was directly funded 100% by the RIAA, the Recording Industry Association of America.
Wait, so the Recording Industry of America was financing a group to protest against them?
Yes.
That sounds like intelligence to me.
It sounds like intelligence, right? Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So the two most well-known board members of the RIAA at the time were Jack Valenti and Charles Bronfman.
Oh, shit. Mega Group co-founder.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking Jewish mob.
We're talking Jewish mob was behind the PMRC. And at the time, remember the Twisted Sister, Dee Snider, came and testified before Congress. Fantastic. All that stuff happened because of Jack Valenti. Jack Valenti was the one leading this charge behind the scenes for the PMRC.
And Jack Valenti is an Italian guy or a Jewish guy?
Both. He's a crypto Jew. So when you dig, if you want to figure out that he's really Jewish,
he's a Zionist.
Well, he's a Jew. He's an actual Jew.
Okay.
Because when you dig into his history and his lineage, his sister married Ted Dinerstein. was involved. He was involved with all these Jewish organizations directly. So yeah, he was a crypto Jew. His father was a Jew. But in America, you got to think at the turn of the century, a lot of these guys came to the country and they changed their names. They changed how they appeared. They didn't want to appear Jewish to anybody. So they would come in and they would appear like they were everyone else, but behind the scenes, they would practice their Judaism. And that's Jack Valenti in a nutshell. There's a lot more politicians out there.
Nothing wrong with that. If you're Jewish, you're Jewish, and I have no problem with the religion component of it. My problem is not the Jewish religion part of it, because, like I said, half my friends I grew up with are Jewish. I used to have to go to temple with them when I'd spend the night at my friend's house. They'd drag me to temple with them the next morning, and so I have no issues with that. Where my problem comes is with Zionism. And as we've talked about this ad nauseum, you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. And so it's more of an Israeli political designation where that group believes something, we believe we should handle the geopolitics differently. And I disagree with the way they handle geopolitics. And again, as I've quoted in the Octopus book, I've got Joe Biden saying, you don't have to be a Jew to be Zionist. I'm a proud Zionist. So it's not limited to that. So I was just curious how that can, listen, I mean, there is that old saying about how the Jews run Hollywood, right? So when you've got a Jack Valenti guy in there, a Zionist who's partnered up with Charles Bronfman, who is a legitimate Jewish mafia guy, it is not unreasonable to suspect that maybe the Jewish mafia is running Hollywood, right? I mean, you've got Lou Wasserman and all these guys. They all have direct connections straight into the mob.
Lou Wasserman was Jack Valenti's closest friend, from what I can tell. He once made the statement that he said, "If you got a problem with Lou Wasserman, you got a problem with me." And so that's how close they were. And then you got to think that is a time when there was a kind of a structural shift in Hollywood where Lou Wasserman, who was controlling Hollywood via Universal Studios, he wasn't with the MPAA, he was with Universal. Jack Valenti then took over Hollywood from Lou Wasserman, but did it as working for the Motion Picture Association of America, not Universal. So yeah, it's an incestuous relationship. All those studios are all in bed with each other. And so it's just one group.
So we know it's not the Cubans, right? Because we know that the CIA was trying to make it look like it was that somebody Cuba related was involved in the Kennedy assassination. But I'll tell you where this leads me. When you start to have a bunch of Zionists involved in the planning of this and intelligence agencies, it was the reason for Kennedy's assassination not having to do with Dimona?
It was 100% Dimona. 100%. Dimona was...
and explain Dimona for people that don't know what that is.
So starting in 1956, the Israelis, via Zalman Shapiro out of Apollo, Pennsylvania, was smuggling hundreds of pounds of uranium from the country for use at a nuclear reactor in Israel. And by 1960, they were outed to the world. Time magazine did a big expose exposing this. So the whole world knew that they were building a nuclear bomb factory. So they kept insisting that it was for peaceful means, like nuclear power, but they wouldn't let inspectors in. They even went as far as to build fake rooms inside the building so as to try to trick inspectors. I mean, they were building a nuclear bomb. They knew it. Everyone knew it. And they were stealing the material from us. John Kennedy knew this, and he knew that they'd been fucking us on smuggling operations since the 40s, particularly with the Sonborn Institute. But Kennedy was done. He's like, fuck these people. All they ever do is lie. They don't come to negotiate. And so many people will think that speech about secret societies that he gave was about communism. It wasn't. It was about the fucking Israelis. And so when you put it in that context, you kind of understand how he saw them as, using infiltration as opposed to, democratic means and stuff like that. So that's who he was talking about. He wasn't talking about communists. So Dimona was in the works, and he was going to shut him down. And getting rid of nukes was Kennedy's number one priority in the world, and getting the bomb was the Israelis' number one priority. And so he wasn't going to fold. He was going to cut all funding. He was going to basically he was going to end the state of Israel. That was what was going to happen. And so the Israelis saw it as an existential threat. And if you know anything about the OSS and Angleton and Donovan and Alan Dulles and these guys, these guys are all diehard Zionists. I don't know when they were compromised, but way, way, way before World War II. But Angleton at the time was the highest level Israeli spy in the American government.
That's James, he gave us Angleton.
Yeah, he gave us. Yeah, he gave them all of our secrets, all of our secrets, right? So the CIA, if you don't think so, the CIA runs at the behest of Tel Aviv, just like the rest of our country. On November 22nd, our country came to an end, and we've been an Israeli colony ever since. That's why your fucking rights don't matter. That's why all this bullshit woke crap is being pushed, just like it was in Germany in 1918 to 1933. We are living through a recycled bit of history. The current state of America is virtually identical to the state of post-World War I Germany, where you had all these same forces actually trying to undermine the culture, pushing communism, pushing homosexuality and transgenderism and all this stuff 100 fucking years ago. And guess what?
They were doing that in Germany as a tool of destabilization that was happening, and then you got to be careful when you do stuff like that, because then you get some strongman that pops up out of nowhere and starts unifying the country against the external threats, and it turns into Adolf Hitler. And you have to be very fucking careful about how long you allow this infiltration and subversion of our culture, regardless of who's involved. I mean, at some point, if you just destroy the culture of a country, you're going to have people that are going to try and reformulate it, and it might not. They might do so with violence. So it's been fascinating to learn like the role of this, because everybody, it's classic misdirection. It's everybody, it's the Cubans, it's the communists, it's nobody ever talks about the possibility of it being Zionist led. They never talk about Dimona power plant as being the justification for wanting Kennedy dead. I mean, there's everyone's got a dozen reasons why they wanted him dead, but it's funny, that one is never one of the reasons that I hear talking about. But when you read it, and when you back up far enough and you understand sort of the plan, if you were Israel and you knew that the American president was coming to get you, and you knew that everybody else was kind of had problems with him too, boy, you could just whack him and pin it on somebody else, and that would be the end of it. And I would suggest that is what happened.
That's their modus operandi for everything, for 9/11, you name it. All the lone gunman assassins, Kent State, like all this stuff.
Now, let's take a look at this interview from The Last American Vagabond with Taylor Hudak interviewing Sasha Latypova about how Pfizer and the Department of Defense defrauded the public.
I think it's fair to say that since the start of the so-called COVID pandemic, it was certainly not treated as a public health emergency, despite it being declared a public health emergency. It was really treated as a national security matter, and it was treated as if we were at war with an invisible enemy. So can you talk about how the governing structure really leads way to this point here, that this is really being treated as if it's a military operation and a national security matter?
Yeah, so in the US, we had this document that's called Pandemic Preparedness Plan. And it was, so there are two versions of it. So one was from 2018, which is hard to find now. It's in that version, it said that the HHS is in charge of, pandemic response, which, okay, if you believe that pandemics can happen, that may be a reasonable thing to put in place, to say that the Health and Human Services would be in charge of a pandemic response strategy, because they have expertise on board, and they would come up with some measures or regulations or advisory to the public, and that makes sense. Now, between 2018 and 2020, that was changed somehow. Not clear what was the process for changing it, but it was changed very drastically. And the 2020 version, which is called Pandemic Preparedness Plan Adapted, makes it completely different. So it says that the National Security Council is in charge of the COVID response policy, And then it designates HHS to some sort of information management roles, also further, when the pandemic was announced by Trump administration, that was announced under Stafford Act, and it put FEMA for some reason in charge of the as a lead federal agency. So there's National Security Council in charge, then FEMA's lead federal agency, which has never had any pandemic plans. So they're kind of a figurehead that doesn't know what they're doing. And then we have HHS performing information management roles. But back to the National Security Council, it's a advisory body to the United States president, and it consists of largely defense and intelligence heads. It does not have any health representatives on it. So nobody who normally attends National Security Council has any health or public health experience. So why are they in charge? But they do have experience with wars and intelligence and other matters. So, we now see United States government organizing itself as if we're at war and using all these war measures acts, defense production acts. And then, the HHS is basically just the information manager. So my question is, why are they telling us it's a health event, and why were they suppressing and censoring all the information? If anybody would even suggest that this biowarfare agent was produced in a lab somewhere, it was immediately you would lose your Twitter and Facebook accounts, because they would be like, no, it's just naturally evolved virus. And remember, our United States governments, while organizing for the war, were lying to the public and simultaneously saying this is a naturally evolved thing from the wet market, which, just basically had some mutations and it's a virus. So, this makes no sense. Why are they lying to us?
I think I would like to go over these DoD contracts, because I find this also just to be generally interesting. I know we did touch on it a little bit earlier, that the DoD is in charge of these contracts with these companies creating these vaccines. And this, again, is managed through Advanced Technologies International, ATI. Again, this is a company that traditionally is involved with weapons, military weapons. So just explain these contracts for us and maybe some of the irregularities that you noticed.
Yes, so I was surprised to find so many contracts. So, again, remember the public communication was that, the Operation Warp Speed is a collaboration between HHS and DoD, and they would represent that collaboration as DoD was just doing logistics. So that was in people's mind. If you ask anybody, they would be, oh, yes, the military is involved because of the logistics and you need to distribute vaccines so fast. So that was my impression until I found these contracts. And when you look at the contracts, it's a different picture. And also I found some public documents. They're available on the FDA website of their internal discussions and PowerPoint with organizational chart and also various kind of roles that they're defined for themselves. And so it's publicly available. So when I read that, it's a completely different picture, because in those documents, in Operation Warp Speed, Department of Defense is the chief operating officer. So it's not just logistics, it's actually in charge of the whole thing. And the HHS only has advisory role. And then there's a whole big structure of executive functions that are all supervised and controlled by the DoD and in general US government. And only down below that, you see pharmaceutical companies organized. But then all these contracts that became available, there are hundreds of them. They're all through DoD, so they're all contracted directly with DoD. Even the in the normal pharmaceutical research and development process, what happens is the sponsor of the product, which is a pharmaceutical company that holds the investigational new drug application with the FDA, then organizes the entire process, because they are on the hook for the liability and they're on the hook for compliance with all the regulations. So then they make sure themselves that they design their own clinical programs, that they have communication with the FDA on all these matters directly. that they hire and select all the vendors that are going to be performing. And there are usually hundreds of vendors in a large pharmaceutical development program. So they hire all the contract research organizations, then make sure and oversee the selection of clinical sites, typically interview every principal investigator, do the IRB. So they do everything themselves, or at least oversee everything themselves, because they're on the hook. Now here we see, okay, Department of Defense in charge of the Operation Warp Speed, then Department of Defense goes and hires all these companies, including, for example, ICON, which is a huge contract research organization for Pfizer project. So that immediately in my mind says, well, who is designing these products? Who is in charge of these products? Who owns them? Because the entity that owns the product is doing this. So that organizational structure and those contracts kind of reveal the picture that the product is owned by the Department of Defense and the US government, not by these pharmaceutical companies.
And that is, just to be clear, not typical.
Not typical at all for a pharmaceutical product, as I said, because, a sponsor who is liable, responsible, accountable, controlled and regulated by good manufacturing practices would never say to another entity, oh, well, you go select that vendor. Because what if that vendor screws up and then I'm responsible for it? So that the liability actually keeps them honest and compliant with the regulations. Also, the enforceability of the regulations keeps them honest. To the extent, I understand there's always corruption and revolving door and all that, but we're in a different space altogether right now. So, I'm saying in the normal process, these are the rules and regulations that exist in place, and also liability exists that the companies wouldn't allow for this situation. They wouldn't say, oh yeah, no, the third party go select, even if it's a Department of Defense, go select a vendor for me. No, they would do it themselves. They would hire the vendor themselves. They would qualify the vendor. They would have a contract with that vendor directly, not some kind of a third-party contract. So that just tells you that whoever, and that's a sign. So whoever does that, where the money flows through, and who hires and selects the vendors and who organizes the whole thing, they own the product.
Now, Sasha, can you think of any reasonable or benign reason that they would do this in this particular situation?
It's actually not reasonable, because this is an extremely complicated manufacturing and organizational. Just to if we believed what they said, that this was scaled up very quickly, and this is a novel technology, but these pharma companies perform these miracles and scaled it up. Okay, if we believe that story, then adding complexities through having these parallel relationships and parallel contracts, it just increases complexity numerous times. So if I were trying to execute a project like this very fast, I would also prefer to control everything myself as a manufacturer. Because if I have to now have these parallel, like I have a vendor, but I also have this other party that hired that vendor, and that party, by the way, doesn't have any pharmaceutical research and development expertise. They're just warriors. Okay, so why add this extra layer of to the already super complex structure? It makes no sense. It's not reasonable. It's actually counterproductive to what they're saying they're trying to do.
It's counterproductive.
Yeah. It's counterproductive because it adds incredible degree of complexity to something that's already incredibly complex.
Then why are they doing this?
So that's a question in my mind, again, because I believe the reason they're doing this, because it's a DoD product. It's controlled by the DoD. It's made by the DoD. We actually know for sure, because we see all these grants going back years from DARPA to these pharmaceutical companies. The technology transfers from DARPA to the IP that's shared with NIH, CDC, DARPA, BARDA. The money relationships, all this going back years. So it all points to the fact that this is product that has been developed by the military for the military purposes, which is, what they develop products for. It's a weapon, and we know that it's a weaponizable tech. We know that it's used in the same exact application as the biowarfare agents as they themselves describe. And now we see this structure that is designed for the control by the Department of Defense and the U.S. government of this entire operation. In this structure, in my mind, the Pfizer and other pharmaceutical manufacturers and subcontractors are simply, fronts, and they implement certain parts of the operation, but they're not in charge of the entire thing. They don't have the view of what's going on through the entire project. And that's also on purpose, because you want to, if you want to do something like this, to pull off gigantic fraud like this, the best way to do it is to compartmentalize it so much, make it extremely complex in the first place, to make it super complex, and then compartmentalize so that the people who are doing it, they don't have to be in cahoots. They can be working in good faith. They can be told to do certain tasks very quickly under panic, saying that, oh, you're saving lives, you're such heroes. And then everyone will keep doing their little tasks while, this gigantic machinery is controlled from somewhere else.
How do these contracts prevent foreign countries from maintaining national sovereignty?
So for the ex-US part of the contracts, they were done differently. So it wasn't DoD. So in the US, it was DoD contracting with all the vendors. In the outside of the US, it was presumably Pfizer making private purchasing contracts. But the way they're written, first of all, it's very hard to get hold of any unredacted ones. They're extremely heavily redacted in the public domain. But there are some that I have seen. There's been a review of a Brazilian contract, and there's also a contract from Albania available without redactions. And you can see that as far as a private purchasing agreement, they make absolutely no sense. And absolutely, you have to be an incredibly unprofessional lawyer to even sign up to something like this, because they have just clauses that go beyond imagination. For example, they are forcing the governments, which are presumably sovereign governments, they're forcing them to suspend all their own laws with regard to good manufacturing practice compliance, import-export rules, product safety regulations, all that. So they're supposed to suspend them for these products. They cannot test the vials on import. So while it says that if the product is non-compliant, this is grounds for dissolution of the contract, at the same time, they prohibit, the government from testing the product which comes across the border. They also require the governments to put up state assets as collateral. So if a private individual in that country is injured by this product, sues Pfizer, wins, Pfizer is liable. Now the government of that country needs to pay instead of Pfizer. And so that to ensure that the government would pay, they also have to put up state collateral, state assets as collateral, such as embassy buildings, military bases, any state assets that the government of that country has.
Now, why would any foreign government sign on to this?
I have no idea why they all signed on to this. Who forced them? Who held a gun to their head to sign? Because the only way you can sign an agreement like this is literally when somebody is holding a gun to your head, in which case it's an illegal contract. It's called predatory contract, obtained under duress, and that alone is grounds to nullify this contract.
Is that a possible avenue to pursue in this case?
I think all the governments should pursue this avenue. I don't know, again, what possible, who holds the power here? Who is forcing all of them simultaneously to sign up to this nonsense? I also should mention that in addition to putting, state assets as collateral for any damages, then they are prohibited by these contracts from performing their national sovereign functions as an independent government, as changing laws in their own country. So this says that the laws cannot be changed in relation to the product liability by the government. So again, who is exerting this much power? I will never believe that this is Pfizer as a private manufacturer of pharmaceuticals, no matter how big Pfizer is. It's again, a private manufacturer of pharmaceuticals can never exert so much power over foreign independent sovereign states.
In our next clip, we will jump to the Tinfoil Hat podcast with host Sam Tripoli and his interview with Whitney Webb.
About on this show before is that there's kind of this push to get you to not believe your eyes, your ears, or your experience.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
So what they kind of do, and I mean, this is like going back to kind of what you just said, which is that, who knows what programs they have. So could they go back and they have a program that can find the video anywhere on the internet, anywhere, and just re-upload it in a way that makes us go, oh, I remember Britney Spears' skirt being plaid. What do you mean it's black now? So, I mean, it's possible. All of it's possible.
Yeah, well, I think the internet, specifically social media, is just like one giant psyop at this point. Like, social media is there to influence you in your perception of what you think and how you perceive how other people are thinking and feeling. Right. And it's pretty much openly admitted, like the military, DARPA specifically, has plunged like so much money into studying social media for the past 20 years. And there's a headline, I think it was on Ars Technica, about how the one branch of the military was trying to find out how they can use social media to control human beings like they control drones. That was the headline. So social media, and if you consider that most social media companies from the time they were created had major national security ties, like with Facebook and DARPA or Google and the CIA, and all of that. I mean, it's a pretty convincing case that this is just a major tool for them to manipulate how we perceive the world and ourselves and world events. And there's been stuff has come out over the years, like Facebook's manipulating people's news feed to make them like feel a certain way, manipulate their emotions and all of that. I mean, they're doing it to us all the time. And we look at a lot of stuff on social media and think it's real, but like even Elon Musk didn't want to buy Twitter because of how many bots are on there. I mean, we don't know how many bots are actually on there, right? Totally agree. And how sure are you that the person you're interacting with is even real? And they want to just disconnect us so much from reality. I mean, that's like what the metaverse is all about. Like, you can date someone in the metaverse and they look a certain way, but it's not totally connected to who they are in real life, and you're not supposed to care. It's all, a new reality and all this stuff. I mean, it's just all totally insane how things are. But like to me today, social media is just all about manipulating people psychologically and making them, like you said, unable to believe, being divorced from what their intuition and their five senses tell them, and critical thinking tells them. So, and you need that to manipulate people at the scale that we're seeing.
So you're talking about this internet event. Do you and the finance, would you tell people to get their money out of banks? And my question, because I get told this by good friends of mine who I love, where do I put my money? If I'm pulling it out, like, should I invest into a house and hope to God that they lose the fucking deed? So I paid you off, bro. I paid you off.
Well, I would definitely get your money out of the big Wall Street banks. Like, if you're banking with like Bank of America,
or Chase,
Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, yeah, I mean, you're screwed. You will be screwed. Santander, is another one. I don't know if they're active in the U.S., but they are in Britain and some other places. They're a Spanish bank, and Deutsche Bank has long been pegged as sort of one of the first banks that's going to totally collapse in this next financial crisis because of, how screwed they are fiscally. So you have them, Santander, and then a bunch of the big Wall Street banks. I'm not a financial expert, but I would say, it would make sense to, if you want the regular banking experience and you don't want to use those banks, look for smaller banks, community banks, or like co-ops and stuff, and try and put your money there. Or look at how, a particular bank fared during the 2008 crisis. Did they have to be bailed out? Did they lose everyone's money? Were they super irresponsible then? Because they'll probably be irresponsible now. If they weren't in 2008, you have a better shot. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what you have to care about, right, is like, how am I going to feed myself and my family and like make sure we can meet our basic needs if the world gets totally insane? And so whatever money of yours you can put in that makes sense. Right.
Now, I know you're not a financial expert, but your feel, do you think it is better to buy gold and silver instead of holding on to regular fractional reserve banking cash?
I mean, possibly, but like what I was just saying. So like, for example, if you have a certain amount of money and you're not sure what to do with it, put it in gold, put it in silver. Like, is it enough to also put in something that's going to keep you and your family fed and like safe during a financial crisis, like a major economic collapse where like society breaks down and goes totally haywire? So for me, I had some money from the book, right? And so I bought like 2 acres somewhere and a little dinky house on it. I'm going to try and farm, right? So we can feed ourselves if stuff gets really crazy. So, I could have put all that money in gold. I could have put all that money in silver, but you can't eat gold and silver at the end of the day, right? You can't eat Bitcoin either. So I don't really know, what it looks like for some people. Like some people, don't want to take that step or whatever, or, maybe Bitcoin or something is part of their way in getting to like, your little lot of land somewhere. If that's how it is for you, cool. If not, cool too. I'm not trying to tell people like what to buy and what to put their money in, but people should start seriously really thinking about like, what would you do if the internet wasn't around tomorrow? Like, how would you feed yourself? If the economy collapses, what would you do? And what kind of stuff like would you like to have on hand? Maybe put some of your money in buying that stuff, like a water filter or, mini indoor greenhouse. I don't know. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff. It just depends on like you. It's very particular to the person. And like, do you live alone? Do you have a family? What kind of area do you live in? Blah, blah, blah. And it's not like a one size fits all type of thing, but I think people need to really start seriously thinking about how to sort of get have more independence from the system, right? Because if the system is going to collapse and the way they're going to try and hurt us into this new system is our dependence on the current system and the fact that so many people are basically slaves to convenience. They'll do anything for like comfort and convenience. Right. That's basically how the smartphone wiggled its way into our lives, right? Oh, look, this is so convenient to have it on a phone. And then the next step is, oh, look, it's so convenient to have Neuralink in my brain, which is basically a smartphone in the brain. And they're already like, people promoting that stuff were already saying like, oh, it's just like the smartphone, and all this other stuff that like, we basically outsourced all of our needs and everything we need to consume to stay alive, to corporations that want to enslave us. So if you don't want to be enslaved, you got to get off the plantation, basically.
Last but not least, let's check this clip from Cristian of The Last American Vagabond with another update on the toxic disaster in Ohio and how the independent testing in East Palestine completely contradicts the EPA.
Stop what you're doing and bring it back to Ohio. Doesn't that just scream competence? Okay, so now they brought it back. Meanwhile, all this has still been sitting there. They then apparently contaminated areas back and forth across this because they didn't even know what they were shipping, or rather they did and didn't want you to know about it. Now, apparently, as of the 27th, but going into March, EPA is to resume the waste cleanup. So let's first start back, end of February, where they're resuming this. Now, it says the United States EPA has announced the cleanup and removal of hazardous waste from East Palestine, Ohio site where Norfolk Southern train, the obvious disaster, will resume on Monday, following a brief pause. So Monday, essentially, we're talking, where were we on the 27th? Just the beginning of March. On Tuesday, February 21st, the EPA legally ordered Norfolk Southern to conduct all necessary actions. Again, why wouldn't that have been the first day? Right? Why wouldn't the EPA say, obviously, you have to do all the things you're supposed to do? And then secondly, why do they even need to say that? But whatever, apparently it's just this big show of, but we're doing what we're supposed to. And now I order you after 20 days, 22 days. It's just, or rather, no, it would 19 days. How stupid. But anyway, that's what they did. And it says, as previously reported, and it says, in response, Norfolk Southern had chosen to contract with licensed hazardous waste treatments and disposal facilities in Texas and Michigan. Apparently, which the EPA didn't care, wasn't involved, and didn't check. Because, protection agency, right? Then, after it already commenced and after it already shipped to multiple locations, then they said, whoa, hold on. Stop that. Don't do that. Halt any additional, it says, stop so that, quote, additional oversight measures could be put in place to supervise where Norfolk Southern disposes of the contaminated materials. Right? So does that just, do I even need to make a joke? Think about how ridiculous that is. So this is a highly serious disaster, which with whether we're talking about dioxins or not, everyone's concerned about the danger of the material they're shipping. That's why it's being dealt with. Right? But before it starts to move across state lines, the EPA didn't do anything. They didn't step in. They didn't talk to them. They didn't ask questions. They just started. And then after it had been done, they go, whoa, wait, now we're going to step in and put some additional oversight measures to make sure that you're even taking it to the right places. Guys, that either is just outrageous incompetence or this is a game that's being played to hide what's happening. On Sunday, Region 5 Administrator Deborah Shore announced that cleanup of hazardous waste at the derailment site will resume. However, will be transported to different EPA-certified facilities than the ones Norfolk Southern originally contracted. How else do you take that but that it wasn't appropriate? Think about that. So what happened then? Why would they take them to sites where it wasn't supposed to go or weren't certified to do so? Or why would they take them to sites that historically had clear records of basically the kind of place you'd go if you want this to be dealt with the way you want it to be dealt with. Groups that have been caught for lying, caught for leaking things out or disposing of things inappropriately, and yet they still do it. We just reported that. So either the EPA got wind of that and nobody's being told what actually went down and said, no, go to the ones we want you to go to. And why did it happen to begin with? You could ask yourself. Or there's something around this that this is all of it's being manipulated. I don't know. But the fact that they stepped in and are now redirecting them to EPA certified sites when that obviously should have been the first way to go, something's happening here. And it could just literally be incompetence, but something tells me it's more than that. Liquid waste from the derailment site will now be taken to Victory, Ohio, while solid waste will be taken to a facility in East Liverpool, Ohio, which before it was Texas and Michigan, both of them crossing state lines and potentially contaminating all along the way. Quote, at EPA, we have decades of experience dealing with hazardous waste, both from cleanup contaminated sites to regulating the landfills where it's disposed of. And we know it's far better to have it safely stored in a properly constructed and monitored disposal facility than remain here longer than necessary. Duh. Really? We're experts and we know that bad things are bad and we don't want bad things here because they're bad because we're experts. Just think about what a dumb statement that is. So we're experts and we know that we'd rather not have it in our backyard. It's like it seems like they just want you to go, we agree with you because nobody agrees with anything that they're doing right now. It says prior to the EPA's decision to halt removal of hazardous waste from the derailment site, Norfolk Southern had already hauled away 20 truckloads. Protection agency, approximately 280 tons of contaminated, not potentially, of contaminated soil and water, of hazardous soil waste, which included contaminated soil to the licensed hazardous waste treatment and disposal facilities in Michigan. Except the problem was, as this site doesn't report, that the Michigan site was a problem, that the EPA said, no, they're not and even the Michigan itself actually spoke up, a Democrat, mind you. Gretchen Whitmer spoke up and said, you can't bring that here. Clearly, everybody's not on the same page. 5 truckloads of contaminated soil have since been returned to East Palestine. Because that makes sense. Not only did it get shipped away, that's just everything they're doing is increasing the potential contamination here. Where about 102,000 gallons of liquid waste, 4,500 yards of solid waste remain in storage, still in East Palestine. As the cleanup process progresses, more liquid and solid waste will be generated. The 15 truckloads of contaminated soil had already been disposed of at the licensed hazardous waste treatment and disposal facility in Michigan prior to the EPA's order. How does that make sense? I mean, I think I read it wrong the first time. So we're talking about, this is the 15 trucks. We're talking about 20 truckloads. Yeah, okay. So 15 of them eventually did. So here's the question. If the EPA had a problem with that, to the point to where they literally stopped them in mid-process and had them ship it all the way back to Ohio, and now they're using different locations, what happened in Michigan? 15 truckloads of very dangerous material was dealt with in a way that clearly the EPA didn't want to be done that way. So what's going on there? And what happened? Is Michigan now a problem? I mean, these are things we should ask. The lack of transparency is staggering. In addition, all liquid waste that has already been hauled out of East Palestine will be disposed of at licensed hazardous waste treatments and disposal facilities in Texas. Same thing. But no additional waste will be sent to Texas or Michigan. Something very fishy. Now here is what we're seeing as of today, March 7th. Headaches, coughing, burning of the skin, symptoms Ohio residents have experienced after toxic train derailment. They're still telling people right now that there's nothing wrong with the air. Now, they could be right, but what's going on then? It's the same game that's played before. They're basically saying if it's not the train wreck, then there's nothing happening. Like the vaccine conversation, right? Well, clearly, though, something is happening. So if we can see that they're having the kind of rashes you might get from both dioxin exposure as well as vinyl chloride or anything else we're talking about here, we should go, maybe there is something happening and we're not being able to find it right now. Or we're using the wrong test. Or we're testing for the wrong chemical. But no, they test for some... Look, if in the very beginning they had tested for just VOCs and nobody raised any kind of concerns about that, and they went forward going, you're good, nothing else was positive, do you think they would have stood up and been like, wait, we want to test for something else? No. They attempted to test for something arbitrary and broad so they wouldn't find anything. And now they're being forced to test for more things. Why? Because things are being found. It's very clear that they are being, this is like every other disaster we've seen in the past, where the company, clearly with the involvement of the government, is downplaying the problem while people are getting sick. Why? We could debate all day long, but that's what's happening here. Health assessment surveys from East Palestine, Ohio, have shown that the most common symptoms experienced by residents since last month's toxic train derailment include headaches, coughing, and anxiety. Now, we're going to get to something in a moment that makes it very clear that every single one of these things perfectly align with the thing that we think is happening. The findings of the survey conducted by Ohio Department of Health and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services were released Friday. Other common symptoms reported by residents were fatigue, irritation, pain, or burning of their skin. That's familiar, right? Burning of their skin. We just talked about all this stuff. DeWine's office said Friday that officials will use the information to better understand how the derailment incident may be impacting residents and determine appropriate public health response. As always, they make this about a community issue like we were talking about, as opposed to acknowledging the real problem. What do we better understand how it's impacting? You don't need to better understand anything. They're sick. They have headaches and rashes. That's it. It's over. We understand. The way this is politics, and it's disgusting. Nearly 3/4 or 74% of the participants who surveyed about all this in their town said they had experienced headaches. 74% since the derailment. 6 in 10 reported coughing, and just over half said they experienced irritation, pain, and burning of their skin. But no problem though. As long as it's not the train and we say it's not the train, then you're crazy. Sound familiar, doesn't it? According to DeWine's office, the state's the EPA, is overseeing train wreck removal operations. The local EPA. And a plan submitted by Norfolk Southern, the removal of tracks, evacuation of soil, and reconstruction of the rails are set to be completed by April 30th. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? So, you know what else happened in all this process? Apparently, Norfolk Southern buried some of this, put train tracks over it, and the trains were running again. But apparently now that they got whatever done, they got done. Well, now we're going to pull it back up again, and we're going to move all the stuff that was there. I can't believe that there are not more people in the middle ground of all this, the quasi-independent, like where this is so plainly obvious. So why were they allowed to do that in the first place? Why did they bury anything? Why were they so quickly eager to get the tracks back up so they could run something only to pull it back up again and stop and clean it all now? Something happened in the beginning of all this. I'm convinced of that. My opinion. That's why 10 days went by before even Fox News was pointing at this. Something is going on. DeWine's office also said water sample results from private water systems continue to show no harmful levels. Now, that could be the case. Of the 157 private systems tested, 57 were verified. So even that, but even right there, there's 100 that haven't been tested yet. Shouldn't you be like, well, we don't know for sure? Nope, of course not. Hazardous waste removal from the derailment is ongoing. The hazardous waste has been hauled to various disposal sites in Ohio. The EPA of Ohio said in total about 3.2 million gallons of liquid wastewater has been removed and approximately 1,700 tons of solid waste. Because that's what it looks like to have a successful, remember they said they dealt with this successfully. Federal and state officials have repeatedly said it's safe for evacuated residents to return to the area, and that air testing in the town and inside all these homes hasn't detected any concerning levels. Okay, remember that. Any concerning levels. So the real crux of the issue is whether they think it's concerning. What do they think is concerning? Is a little bit over the level that's safe concerning to them? Probably not. Is it to you and your baby? Yes, it is. On Monday, Governor Josh Shapiro's office said he met with Norfolk Southern, the CEO, Alan Shaw. Oh, great. Somebody gets to meet with him. Apparently the people of Ohio don't, though. According to the governor, the company will pay $5 million to reimburse fire departments for equipment that was contaminated or damaged. $1 million to Beaver and Lawrence counties to help business owners and residents whose livelihoods were damaged. Another $1.4 million will go to state agencies that responded, of course, including for setting up a health clinic for residents. Okay, you know what that all boils down to? $6.4 million for the government. $1 million, maybe for you. Probably not, though. That's what's happening. So making money off a disaster, that's not what the government does. $5 million I guess making money is a bit of a stretch if you're reimbursing fire departments, but $5 million for reimbursing fire departments for equipment that they claim was contaminated, damaged, right? So either way you spin that, I guarantee you there's going to be things that the government might have wanted to do. They're probably going to use the money for. This is $5 million for the fire department. That's the government, guys. $1 million to these specific counties to help business owners and residents who were damaged by this. $1.4 million to state agencies that responded. So now we're literally giving the EPA at least some of this money for what? For not doing their job? How about we give $6 million to the people of Ohio? How about that? Of course not, because that's not how this works, guys. Any time they can use this to benefit, that's what's going to happen. Meanwhile, they're still coughing and burning and having headaches and nausea, but don't worry, our tests say you're fine. Here's $1.4 million. Damn it, I knew that was going to happen. But luckily, I did, in fact, do this. God, even though I have these screenshots, I want to break the computer when this happens. It drives me crazy that when my highlighting goes away. By the way, I was looking this up today, and it seems to be a Brave problem. Apparently, there's some weird thing with Brave where it allows these auto refreshes all the time. And every time people have brought it up on Brave's conversations, they delete the subject. It's interesting. Anyway, I was looking into it today. Something weird there. In any case, let me look real quick and bring these up. Of course, that's so funny. Well, I'm not even going to tell you what I'm doing with right now, but let's see. Okay. I'm just going to read you this real quick. So I got these, let's see, give me 1 second. God, see, this is what just effing frustrates me. The air in East Palestine contains higher than normal concentrations of 9 potentially harmful chemicals. 9. The air in East Palestine contains higher than normal concentrations of 9 potentially harmful chemicals. Scientists have suggested. Did you? Guys, you gotta be kidding me. Or you mean they've tested and found? Yeah, great job, Daily Mail. Even you're reporting about it, though, you would mean suggested, like the way that they frame this stuff. But the point is, as the title reads, air in East Palestine is toxic. Scientists release report showing higher than normal concentrations of 9 potentially harmful chemicals, despite the EPA saying otherwise. 9. Experts from Texas A&M and Carnegie Mellon University have conducted their own air quality tests using a mobile testing unit in East Palestine. They said that if the chemicals persist at current levels, it could cause long-term health issues. Why are we even debating this right now? The EPA either didn't do what they're supposed to, or is incompetent, or is blatantly lying about this. They tested and found all the 9 chemicals, and we're going to pretend that the EPA didn't find those things, or rather that the Norfolk Southern did it and then lied about it, probably. Either way you want to play this, this is what's being found by anybody independently testing. There's been multiple people. We're going to show you the clip of the other guy who tested as well. The finding is in direct contrast to the EPA. Their ongoing assurance that it's not just that it's safe. They keep telling us that. While they said the findings are not necessarily an immediate health concern, they said repeated exposure over time could be damaging. Now, the real point is, I want to make it all this is, guess what they're not testing for? Dioxins. I think that's the obvious elephant in the room. Now, all of this is a problem, right? The vinyl chloride, the stuff, this is the lingering problem. They're testing for those things and they're still finding that. Think about that. They're finding vinyl chloride now in the air, right now. I don't even know it's possible personally, based on what we've read about this. But again, I'm not the expert. But they're not testing for dioxin. And so I think that's what's causing the real problems we're seeing based on all the expert discussions that we've seen, as well as the information, the studies we've read. We go to the next one. Now it says, there are already warning signs amongst residents. Let's see. I can see what I'm looking at there. I'm looking at my screenshot so I can see it. There are already warning signs among residents, including reports of altered voices, which, by the way, I'm not convinced that part of it, something about that seemed off to me, but regardless, I don't know if there's anything that we know that this could do in regard to the chemicals, which apparently that's possible. I wouldn't dispute it. I mean, we should ask whether it's happening. But we know for sure that we see chemical burns. We see that what they call chloracne. It's the literal term specifically because of vinyl chloride. Or rather, no, I take that back. I think it was the dioxin part of it. But I think both of them are capable, and I think that's what we found. Both the vinyl chloride part of the the rashes, as well as dioxin specifically causing the chloracne part of it. But it says Dr. Albert Presto is an associate research professor of mechanical engineering at Carnegie Mellon's Walter E. Scott Institute for Energy Innovation, who is part of the university's chemical monitoring effort in East Palestine. Right? This is not some random person from YouTube. These are experts testing their job, chemical monitoring. That's part of the university's. He's part of the university's chemical monitoring effort. Right? This is being done by the school itself. How is it possible that they could find something so directly contrary to what the EPA is saying? Unless there's somebody lying at some point. Now he says the materials that dumped onto the ground or into the water could re-emit from the ground whenever the temperature changes or whenever it's windy. So there you go. So the idea that we've already talked about, the idea that they could be testing selectively on the tops of the water and so on to intentionally get the right kind of readings. Or maybe it's on a less windy day. We've seen these kind of things happen where some days it's worse, some days it's not. Maybe there's just selective testing going on. Either way, this is showing you that there is a problem. I mean, it's as simple as that. It's saying, let's see, where was I? It says, we don't know necessarily what the long-term risk is or how long that concentration that causes that risk will persist. But what they do know is that it's happening right now. Now it says that they compared their data in East Palestine to levels of the same chemicals recorded this month by the EPA. That says, as of yesterday, the EPA had screened the air for 578 homes and declared that the chemical pollution levels are not above residential air quality standards. Now, guys, the only way that makes sense is if, for some reason, which would make sense, that the government and the EPA have created a level that they say is the normal standard, but still dangerous for you. Or they're lying about the level and these people are finding the real level. Either way, both of them make sense to me. Like, there's a whole point to get into, which I'll make a point about when we get to the dioxin part next, that the background problem of dioxins prior to this accident was a real problem. And maybe that's exactly why this action was chosen, knowing that it would just blend in with the allowed problem that our government has not done anything about. There's a lot around all of this. But it goes on to say,
and thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Independent Review. Make sure to check out the main website, indreview.org, for links to all of the interviews. See you all next week.